This is Geography 130. This is lecture number 4. One housekeeping matter. I learned yesterday that the deadline for instructor drop is Tuesday. I take it that the deadline for you to drop is not that soon, right? Somewhat later. Nonetheless, what that means is that on Monday, when I sit down with the GSIs, we're going to look over the registration, the list of people who are enrolled. We'll look at the waiting list, which is, last I checked, had shrunk, but only to about 30 from about 40 or 45 or something. So there are clearly still quite a few people on the wait list. On Monday, if we find names of people who are enrolled in the class but have not come to section and have not touched base with us, and there are still people on the wait list at that point, we will drop the people who have not shown up in section and not explained their absence in order to make room for people on the wait list. I believe, as of yesterday, based on not all of the sections but about half of the sections, there were at least 10 or 12 people who fit that description. Is that right, Nathan? So we will do everything we can on Monday or Tuesday to make room for people on the wait list who want to get in. I don't know if that will be enough room for everyone. I also don't know how many more students may choose to drop the class after that deadline has passed. But that's everything that I can do to try to sort of force this issue, and then we'll see how things shape up from there. Okay? Are there any other housekeeping matters that you need to bring up? You want to bring up? Okay. Yeah. Are you going to do it here? Yes, I am. I haven't done it yet. I apologize. It should happen this afternoon or tomorrow. Okay? All right. So the readings for today may have seemed a little bit of a grab bag, or a little bit difficult at first glance to relate to the readings we've done thus far. There is a rather arbitrary reason for that, which is that 2 years ago, when we got to this date on the calendar, it was the date of the Focus the Nation teach-in for climate change awareness. And I was scheduled to be one of the speakers at that event, so I wasn't able to give a lecture. So I canceled class, and I told everyone to go to that. And I assigned a couple of short readings related to climate change in connection with that event. Obviously, this year, we are having a lecture, and those readings are still on the syllabus. It may seem a little hard to make sense of why that should be, because on the face of it, the relationship of climate change to the main focus of the class may be a little bit tangential. On the other hand, in fact, I would argue the relationship is not tangential. Perhaps that's already come up a little bit in previous lectures when we've gotten into questions of energy and the relationship of energy to population. The fact from Libby-Bacci that in many ways you can identify these moments when human population growth increased significantly over a prior trajectory as moments when greater amounts of energy became available, readily accessible to the people living in those populations. I'd say the connections actually run a lot deeper than that. The ways in which food is produced have a lot to do with the energy, the form and amount of energy available to a given society. And for that matter, the way in which food is produced today represents a significant contributing factor to the overall emission of greenhouse gases in our society and in our atmosphere. So in that sense, the connections are quite real. With that said, when I went back and did the readings for today, I was left thinking, well, this is interesting. What we've got is a lot of different pieces, from forests and carbon in forests to choices about what kinds of crops to grow where, to debates about healthcare reform and the health of the American population, the costs related to health insurance, how they compare to or how they relate to the ways in which food is produced and consumed in this country. How do we bring all those pieces together? How do we think about them? Because obviously they do relate to each other, even though they're frequently treated as separate policy debates. And so what we end up with today, kind of bringing together these different pieces and then trying to think about how to situate them relative to the syllabus as a whole, is kind of a really big picture step back and think about all of the pieces here. Or rather, instead of just thinking about food and population, the way Malthus will when we get to Malthus, and rather than just thinking about it as humans and their environment, or organisms and their biological reproductive capacity on the one side, and the environment in which they find themselves, and the constraints or resistance that those environments present to those organisms, let's try to think about more than just those simple dualistic kind of pairings, and bring these together in a broader framework. And think about them not just as policy debates that are happening right now or in the last couple of years, reaching back to this Focus the Nation event, but over the broader sweep of human history, as Libby-Bacci sort of began to give us a perspective last time. So, hence these rather large terms, concepts in this first slide. Soil, plants, climate, and people. Nature and culture. Food versus fuel. Coevolution and fire. Here are the readings for today. The first is the piece from Science that is referred to. Oh, actually, I did one more reading thinking it was for today, and it actually isn't until later in the semester. This piece from Science will come up again later in the semester. It will be referenced by George Monbiot in one of his pieces about biofuels. The Leo Lewis article from the Times Online of London, summarizing the ways in which the turn towards biofuels in certain parts of the world have impacted the price of chips, beer, other kinds of basic commodities, beer being, of course, a staple, in other parts of the world. Michael Pollan's op-ed piece, from last fall about the relationship of the agro-industry lobby in this country to the health insurance and medical lobby in this country. And then finally, Stephen Pine's chapter from his book World Fire, Consumed by Either Fire or Fire, which in a sense is the big step back perspective on these issues that I want to try to explore today. Okay, so here's a starting point, for better or worse. The pieces that we're going to try to, that hopefully we'll get to provide a kind of framework in which to situate the readings for today. We have humans and their relationship to, and I mean, I could have put more arrows in here. There probably should be an arrow from humans to plants and humans to climate, that kind of thing. But I figured this was enough arrows to provide the basic idea, which is that all of these pieces are related to each other. They all interact with each other, and we're going to try to make sense of those interactions. So we've got humans, soil, plants, fire, climate, and then fuel/energy. And we want to think about the interactions among these components. Think of them as a more interesting way of beginning the analysis of human-environment interactions, more interesting, that is, than just food and population, or humans and environment. I didn't ask you to read this book, Topsoil and Civilization. A couple years ago, I did ask students to read some chapters from this. But I thought I would use this. If you trace the 20th century history of American popular literature about environmental problems, and you trace it back, you don't start with Silent Spring and Rachel Carson, for example, which is often treated as the sort of beginning point of the modern environmental movement, right? And that dates to the 1960s. But you trace it back further, and you look at the ways in which problems of the environment have been popularized in the U.S. Often, I mean, the thread is that problems emphasized as big problems, big, urgent problems, crises. You find that in the first half of the 20th century, the rubric in which this was expressed was always soil. There was a very strong focus on soil erosion as the big fundamental environmental problem that we needed to address. And this predates, and in many ways prefigures, formulations of the problem in terms of population. There's a very tight relationship hinging on the 1920s and 1930s, in which earlier treatments had said this problem is about erosion and soil, and this is the fundamental thing we have to worry about, to focusing on population. And it becomes the fundamental problem that needs to be addressed. This book from 1955 is somewhat at that cusp, that turning point. It's a little bit later, perhaps, but it's instructive, I think, for the way it formulates the issue, and it gives, I think, an interesting perspective from which to then think about formulations in terms of population, right? So Vernon Gill Carter and Tom Dale write this book, Topsoil and Civilization, and they talk about soil and soil formation as being the fundamental basis on which civilization arises. You can't have civilization without topsoil, therefore, and of course this is somewhat specious logic, therefore the most important thing to think about if you're worried about our civilization is topsoil. Doesn't really follow, but that's the way they framed it. So soil formation is a geological, ecological process, 350 million years old, give or take, and it's what they characterize as a positive feedback loop that we should all be very concerned about and very interested in which plants create soil. Right? Soil is produced over geological time periods by the process of plants growing and then dying and decaying and decomposing and providing the sort of raw material from which soil is made. Soil, as it builds up, provides the medium in which plants grow, and therefore you can have more plants if you have more better soil, and that in turn produces more soil, and this is all very magnificent and magical and miraculous. This simple kind of idea then becomes the way in which we can think about the threat to civilization posed by soil erosion. This is all framed within a very, very strong dichotomy between nature and culture. And here, this it resembles the dichotomy between humans and environment that I was emphasizing on Tuesday. This idea that there is this realm called humans or humanity, and then a separate realm called nature or the environment. And you think about how this dichotomy shapes up, what its content is. On the one side, you have nature, which is characterized as dynamic but fundamentally equilibrial. It maintains a certain kind of balance even as it changes. So the plants and the soil feed on each other in a positive feedback loop, but they are sort of mutually controlling. The amount of soil you have is a function of the plants. The amount of plants you have is a function of the soil. It can change, but it remains harmoniously in tune with the different parts. It's mechanistic. We can look at its processes and understand them and, in turn, control them to the extent that we understand them. It's timeless and universal. This will become a big part of Malthus's argument. It's a big part of a lot of treatments of natural sciences, physical sciences as a whole, that the knowledge about them that we have is knowledge about something that is independent of history, because these are natural laws. These are universal laws. It's the condition of possibility for culture. Without topsoil, you can't have civilization. To that extent, it is, the natural world is the substrate on top of which, and thanks to which, human social formations can even arise. It's not precisely determining of what those formations will be, but it imposes some kind of limit on them. And here again, that idea of environmental resistance. You remember last time I talked about the notion, or the possibility that there was logical circularity built into this, right? That environmental resistance is made necessary as a concept by postulating the possibility or the concept of organisms independent of their environment. That is another way of, or another expression of this strong dualism between nature and culture that runs way back in the Western philosophical tradition. On the other side, you have culture. Culture being, in many ways, synonymous with civilization. We don't think about sort of prehistoric humans as having culture in the same way that we think about full Homo sapiens having culture. It's progressive in the sense that it is embedded in history. It's got a linear path that it follows that builds on earlier developments and advances and creates novelty. It's historical and contingent. It's not universal and timeless. It is embedded in and depends on the contingent factors that come into play in historical time. It's potentially disruptive of equilibrium. It's dependent on nature but denies the fact. And a lot of environmental literature is an attempt to raise awareness of the fact that civilization, humans, culture are dependent on nature, even though we seem to think of them as separate realms, right? So sort of reestablishing an awareness or establishing awareness of these dependencies is a big part of environmental education, so to speak. So here's a typical passage from Topsoil and Civilization. Civilized man has despoiled most of the lands on which he has lived for long. This is the main reason why his progressive civilizations have moved from place to place. It has been a dominant factor in determining all trends of history. A sort of common motif in this literature is to tell the story of the rise and fall of civilizations, and classic examples being Mesopotamia, the Middle East. The birthplace of agriculture, lands that were once rich agricultural oases, and we think of them as oases now because today they're deserts, right? It's like, whoa, what happened? Where did these civilizations go? Places where there were once tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people living in modern cities, the cutting edge of what we think of as civilization, and today you look and it looks like desert. And these types of stories become the kind of, it's still actually a common organizing narrative principle for this kind of literature, right? Jared Diamond's Collapse is about narrating these stories of rise and fall of major civilizations and trying to explain what happened, right? And explaining them in terms of somehow failing to take care of the environment, failing to understand or live within the limits of the environment. Here, this is framed within a narrative in which civilization has been moving westward, right? And now it's in the United States. This is where we have the most grand and opulent civilization. And isn't it fortunate that we happened upon a continent that had abundant amounts of topsoil? That must somehow be why we have risen to such wealth and power. I'm not joking. This is how this is constructed in these kinds of books, and there are others that I could mention. There's a famous one called Deserts on the March, which actually anticipates this one. So how do they put this argument together? It's a fairly standard one. You may have seen this before. What differentiates people from other kinds of organisms is the way in which we produce our food using tools and conscious thought. We produce clothing and shelter as well. We don't simply take it from nature. We produce a surplus. If we can produce a surplus, then we can produce civilizations. We can support cities. We can have people who don't produce food but instead produce the various things that we associate with culture, everything from religion and art to music and politics. The civilizations, cities are the result of this. What makes this possible? I mean, we can come up with a kind of short list here. Soil and forests, grasslands, fish and wildlife, usable water, basic components of the natural resource base from which this surplus has to be somehow produced and extracted. Now, the part of this book that is perhaps most amusing from our vantage point today, but we shouldn't just laugh at it because very similar maneuvers can be found in books that we take more seriously today, right? The idea that environmental decay or degradation is somehow reflective of and a function of some kind of social or moral decay, ethical decay. I mean, pardon me, but Pat Robertson is doing this, right? The Haitians get nailed by an earthquake because of their ethical or moral lapses. Nature comes back in vengeance against these types of, degenerative peoples, right? In this case, soil erosion becomes a kind of analogy or a metaphor for a decaying civilization. Therefore, soil conservation is what we have to do to keep the foundation under our civilization. They reject other causes as simply proximate or wrong. If it's a war, it must be because there's declining food production, which is because of soil erosion, right? That kind of thing. It's actually ultimately all about topsoil. We see, instead of a positive feedback, we see a negative feedback. Cropping practices that result in erosion lead to less soil, which lead to less crops, lower production, which in turn causes everyone to farm all the harder, farm lands that shouldn't be farmed, and that causes still more erosion. Now, later in the semester, we'll read part of Donald Worster's treatment of the Dust Bowl, and you'll begin to see that this is in reaction to a very real environmental crisis. And actually, at the time that it happened, the Dust Bowl was orders of magnitude larger than any environmental crisis we had thought about previously. I mean, it was gargantuan. These huge clouds of dust coming off of the Great Plains and blowing literally all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Huge, hundreds and thousands of square miles of farmland just blown out and left in the form of sand dunes, basically. This was the reality to which books like this responded, okay? Hence the sense that somehow we needed to mobilize attention and public support, we needed to mobilize the government, we needed to mobilize policies and public agencies that would tackle this problem and solve it. And conservation was the movement that embodied and carried this message forward. And this is very much the message that Carter and Dale are trying to drive home in the 1950s. By this point, it was already 20 years old, but they still felt it was necessary to make this case. Conservation can restore the positive feedbacks and save civilization. They made the argument that the United States was at a turning point in 1955, and they invoked the legacy of Hugh Hammond Bennett, who we will talk about again later. He was the first head of the Soil Conservation Service in the United States. In many ways, he was the force behind the creation of the Soil Conservation Service and its efforts. I mean, it was a public agency devoted at the base of it to preventing soil erosion. And it was a very successful. It still lives on to this day in the form of the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And it had this kind of missionary zeal in forming it. Bennett himself had a very, very powerful, charismatic personality driving this kind of move forward. And if you start looking at events in other parts of the world, including Africa, parts of Asia, Australia, Hugh Hammond Bennett's influence extended around the world precisely because the Dust Bowl was an apocalypse of sorts that was noticed elsewhere in the world, and because the Soil Conservation Service and its ideas about proper farming practices became part of the prescriptions implemented in colonial and post-colonial settings elsewhere in the world in the name, again, of saving civilization. I mean, with a very, very powerful moral component to the message. So this is not somehow a parochial matter. This is the theories about the relationship of soil to society were not brand new in the 1950s, and they had roots early in the 20th century in theories about ecology and plants and how plants grew. And these theories are worth thinking about in this connection. So what determines the vegetation in any given place? What determines what grows in a given place? What would you say in answer to that? Soils? Arid soils or just soils? Okay. Sunlight? Climate? Okay. Climate and soil. Rainfall would be part of climate, right? Yeah. Seem like the basic stuff, right? The basic building blocks from which vegetation is produced. I mean, it says right here at the bottom, of the world's many patterns of physical geography, climate, or the long-term average of weather conditions such as temperature and precipitation, is the most important. And it's true that if you know about vegetation, you can infer a great deal about climate, and vice versa. The two are linked in very important ways. So here's a map of the world according to climate. You don't need to memorize it, but just get a sense of, okay, how does that all fit together? You map that against precipitation, and you see broad similarities. There's an isomorphism to precipitation and climate. And that, in turn, can be traced in a map of vegetation types. Not very complicated. This is the basic building blocks from which a lot of geography